Alright, welcome to Turbo's Tech Table. This is episode 3. Today we're going to be going over a pneumatic poppet marker. And if you're watching episode 2 on the spider, there's going to be a lot of similarities there. So if you have a spider or a spider clone, go watch that video. But if you have a high-end like an Ego, E-Tech, any other pneumatic poppet, this video will pretty much cover it. Of course, there's going to be some differences between individual models, but today we're going over, this is a Vanguard Creed, and it is set up like the vast majority of poppets out there. So one of the things that I usually like to do when I get started on these is to first remove the macro hose, and I've already done that here. Just pull your connectors apart, get it out of the way. Most markers from around 2011 or so and previous will use a standard regulator in the front here, screw in, but starting around 2012 most of these designs went to a non-standard regulator, so they either don't screw in or some of them are internally plumbed. So it's still right here. This is still kind of a standard design because it uses macro, but the regulator does not unscrew like the vast majority of them out there. This one comes apart a little different in that you need a big wrench. It is kind of a smart design, but it just is a little different. I use my big, I think this 1/4 inch wrench here and unscrew the entire regulator assembly. And then it all pulls out. I've already actually done a rebuild on this. These are kind of a cool design because this is essentially the regulator core right here. It comes all out in one piece. And then to get the rest of the shell off, there is a Allen that's buried in here. Which, if I can get the right size here. And the right leverage. Alright, use our little leverage tool here. This is kind of one of the downsides when you get into designs that are not standardized. Sometimes you gotta find certain ways around working with them. Alright, so get the shell out of the way there. There's our screw, which I might keep an eye on if you have one of those screws. This one, if you can tell, the first few threads on here, it looks like might be a little messed up, so I might try and replace that screw at some point. But the shell to that regulator here just comes off and that gets out of the way. On most markers like these poppets, this front piece here that's under the barrel is actually the low pressure regulator. On this one it's a really cool design because you can just remove this pin here, if I can get some grip on it, and that's all that holds it in. Usually. Well, I guess today we're unscrewing it. So here is what's right under the cap here. There's usually a plate in here, your spring, and then this is going to be the your main seal of the regulator. And usually the way these work, they have a higher piece on one end, and that always fits into the spring. So if you're putting it back together, you're not sure which way to face this, just kind of look at how it's designed. The spring really doesn't look like it goes in that way, but there's this nice little centering post here, so the spring definitely goes in that way. What's left in here is a Schrader valve, which is what actually controls when the regulator is open and closed. Get that guy out, and that's what the Schrader valve looks like. Really simple little guys. You push on them from one end, the other end opens. I don't know if you guys can see that. So that's exactly how it works in there. Once the pressure gets lower on this side here, there's enough pressure to open it up on the other side, and it lets some air through until the pressure equalizes. So on most markers like this, you're gonna have eyes on actually I can't think of one that doesn't. So one of the things in that regard is you have to, before you take the frame off, you have to take the wires off that run to the board. And a lot of times I just like removing the grips entirely. And if you are doing a full rebuild on this, getting the grip frame off is a necessity, because you have to there's a set screw in the bottom of the body that holds the valve core in place, and the only way to get that out is to remove the grip so you can get to the screw. So 2 wires here, one of them goes to the solenoid, one of them goes to the eyes. Just unplug them both. This one also has a 3rd wire, and that's for the battery pack because it has an internal battery. Typically, you only have 2 grip frame screws, one at the front, one at the back. Get rid of both of them, and sometimes keep an eye out because sometimes they can be different lengths, so you don't want to go cramming one of them into the wrong hole and screw something up. So just keep an eye on when they come out, which one is which, and it is the case here. So the longer one, in this case, is going in the back. Keep that in mind for later. When you're removing the grip frame, just do it gently and keep an eye on those wires. You don't want them getting caught up on anything while they come off. So a couple things you'll see under here. This hose here, and you'll see this in a lot of like E-Techs have them. I believe Egos do not. I know there's a few other designs out there that run this. What it is the air from the low pressure regulator is coming into this hose, and this goes back to the manifold, which the solenoid controls. So once the air gets back here, solenoid controls it from there. You don't necessarily need to remove that when you're doing a rebuild. You can replace it every once in a while if you deem necessary. On these, one little trick on these Vanguards is this hose. Since you can't get parts directly from Vanguard anymore, since they are no longer in business, there's hose you can use for the Smart Parts Ion or the GOG Envy, those kinds of, whatever Ion clone you want to talk about. The hose from those, the internal hose, is close enough to the same diameter that you can replace it. The Ion hose is just a little bit smaller, and in my experience it actually fits on these barbs just a little bit better. So if I run into a case where I need some new hose, I just go grab some of that stuff. Let's see where to go from here. So let's get the bolt out of the way, pull the pin up, bolt sides out. This bolt in particular uses kind of a funky setup with the O-rings. They are technically kind of a square O-ring. You can replace them with round ones, no problem. Get the ram out of these guys. There's usually just a set screw in the back. that guy, which I might have some problems with here, which I will deal with later. So what I'm doing here is removing, usually it's a screw that holds the whole valve core in place. In this case it's kind of a, it's a little bit different setup. I'll explain once I get this guy out here. They worked a little funky. Alright, back again. I had to do some little slight Dremel work. Basically what had happened is somebody had used the wrong Allen wrench on this guy here and stripped it out, so I couldn't remove it with an Allen. I had to drill a slot, and so now I can get it out with a screwdriver. And I will be replacing it with the correct screw that is not stripped out. I just have to keep that guy so I can go to the hardware store a little later. So like I was saying, this guy comes out. This is actually a whole piece that comes out here, just like that. And what that little notch is, or the little piece there, is to hold in the valve core assembly. I also took care of getting the back cap off here because, once again, somebody has used the wrong Allen wrench and completely messed up the inside of that. That one's going to take a little bit more effort to fix because I'm going to have to re-thread it and then basically permanently put a screw in place there. So kind of unfortunate there. This is why you use the correct screws, or the correct wrenches though. If you put your wrench in and you start feeling some play, you probably don't have the right size wrench. So keep that in mind when you guys are taking stuff apart, because do not want to end up in a situation where you need to pull out saws to get a wrench out. So with that back cap off though, what I can do is use an Allen wrench, since the bolt's out of the way, put it all the way down in the marker and push the bolt, or the ram backwards. And it's not quite going to come all the way out there. So I'm going to put the wrench in this way and push it out just a little bit more. Just got to find the right height here. There it goes. So there's your ram. And this is an extremely simple ram. 2 O-rings on it, and this front O-ring here, all it is a bumper. There's nothing more to it. It's just there to kind of cushion the forward movement. The one in the back here does seal air, and it seals. So what happens is when this is in place, here's the bolt, it attaches there. What happens is there's air in the back, or when you pull the trigger, air gets put in the back here. This comes forward, hits the valve. Air goes up through the bolt just like it does in the Spider. Same idea, except the only difference is instead of a spring back here, it's air controlling the movement. And then when it's done firing, this whole assembly comes back, new paintball falls in place. So we also got the rest of the LPR assembly out here while I was off camera a little bit. Make sure when you're putting this thing back together, you get the spring back in place. That's keeping what it is your valve spring. It doesn't matter which way there. Some of them do though, I should mention. Some valve springs do matter which way they go in, and how you tell is how they're shaped. Sometimes they're conical, and so they're smaller at one end than the other. Usually the smaller end will go towards your valve, but there could be some designs out there that I'm just not aware of that work opposite. So next thing is to get this whole valve core out. Usually you can do that with a swab, but I don't know if that's the case here. I think we're going to have to go forwards, which I don't think the swab is going to cut it. So we're going to try some macro hose here. See if that does the trick. There it goes. So the hole, I don't know if you can see that through the hole there. But the whole valve core assembly here comes out. Voila. This is essentially your valve in a Spider, except it's all kind of contained in one piece. So there's a couple things to note here. Well, first of all, this one has oil all over it, and I'm not sure why, because it's not supposed to. Somebody has been having some fun with this thing. Usually the valves in these are a little bit different because they do not need blowback air. So a lot of times they will have this second O-ring on the stem, and that's to prevent shot air from escaping up through the bolt pin. Makes it slightly more efficient. And then also another thing to keep in mind is there's usually a couple O-rings internally on these guys. So on this one there's two. There's one in the back here, it's internal. Don't know if you can see that, hopefully. And then there's another one that's towards the front here that's internal. And so those two O-rings are kind of important. They're sealing a lot of air off. This guy is sealing from, here's your ram. That internal one there is what's sealing the air in this area here. So when the bolt is pushed back, it's stopping it from escaping up the bolt, or the bolt pin area. And then the one in the back here is sealing air from getting in between in this space here. Because you wouldn't want it in either area, because you don't want the air from the valve pushing out or pushing the valve back. The air is on this side of the valve, keeping it close. So here's kind of what it looks like when it's all in place inside the marker. Here's your lower tube. I'll put the ram just above it there. Here's your bolt. And so LPR up here. Here's your your high pressure air coming through. The high pressure air also comes into the LPR here and then travels down the hose to the solenoid, which then controls your air on either side of the ram here. The ram sits about there until air is put behind it, flies forward, hits the valve, opens the valve there, so there's a nice big opening there. That air comes up through the hole here, which is then lined up with the bolt, and out down the barrel, bang goes the paintball. So, put all that aside. Nothing too crazy about getting those O-rings out and replacing them. Just use some good picks and take some patience. One thing I should go over real quick is the eye covers here. Oops, wrong one. If I can find the right wrench. I can tell by taking this apart, somebody has definitely Loctited these screws in place, which is a good thing, as long as you're using blue Loctite or the non-permanent. Never ever use red Loctite. One thing I just noticed though, so this is the detent here, holds the ball in place when it's ready to fire. And they're actually looking pretty good, but it is missing a spring. There should be a spring behind the detent to keep it pushed into the breech there. So I'll need to scrounge one up, find a new one there. Do the same thing on the other side. Let's see if there's a magic. Oh, actually, there's the spring. It just flew off. So magnets, very useful on workbench. Keep things sticking around. Yep, there's my spring on this side. Let's stick that to the magnet. Same thing here, there's definitely Loctite on that screw. And these are kind of designed to be easy to take off, so you can service everything, keep them clean, that kind of stuff. There's my eyes. Let's get this one out. And then we can get the hose out of the way here. Pull the eyes out. I'm kind of doing a complete rebuild here, so I'm just kind of tearing the marker down to its bare essentials, bare body. Just be careful with those when you get them out. The only other thing that's left here, if you can see through there, there's both tubes all the way end to end. So the only thing I have left really is this hose here. This guy is, I've worked on a Creed before, and it is a little bit difficult to kind of get in and out, and especially attach the hose to it. So if you're gonna take it out, definitely kind of know what you're doing. It takes some patience, but I'm definitely getting it out of here so I can, because there are 2 O-rings that are on this plug here, and I want to replace them. Oh, and you see, so that came out without the hose in place, and that is actually supposed to come out with the hose in place, so that's telling me that this hose is probably done. It's feeling okay there. We'll see though. So these 2 O-rings, they don't get a whole lot of abuse, but it is good to replace them from time to time, just so I don't have to deal with them while I'm at the field. But if you're not really having issues with them and you don't feel like getting into it, I wouldn't even bother. So last thing I have on here is the manifold and the solenoid. Oops, and there goes our manifold. So there's this weird kind of custom seal going on here on the bottom, so just be careful of these guys, because you can't replace them anymore, or you can't get new ones anymore as far as I know. Just basically grease it up, put it back in place if you ever take this off like I am. I'm kind of doing this as a inspection as well, to see what, if anything, is kind of out of place. But everything else looks pretty good. The only thing left on the body here is the feed neck, which I'll get to later, but it's just remove the screw. Feed neck comes off, you can clean underneath it if you want to. There's nothing really to maintain a whole lot on the feed neck other than just make sure you have some blue Loctite on your screw here so it doesn't come loose, or especially your bottom one here that holds it in place, so you don't have that coming loose in the middle of a game. So besides that, when you're reassembling everything, just make sure and get your wires all the way through the body first, and so they're sticking out when you put the grip frame back on. Be sure and thread the wires into the grip frame before you screw it down in place, and be careful of those because they are, you don't want to pinch your eye wires here on any marker. Alright, I know it seems like I was only gone for a few seconds, but it's been about a week actually, and I have my helper here, really wants to help. To make a long story short, when I got into this thing, I found some problems that needed addressing, because more or less the previous owner, was an idiot and used the wrong size of Allen key on a few key parts of it. So this is the back cap for the ram assembly, and what he had done, this used to be a, see if you can see that, this used to be a Allen key just to go straight down in here, but he had stripped it out completely. It was rounded, and so I had a fun time getting it out, but I knew I needed to fix that because otherwise you can't get the ram in and out. So what I had to do is cut down on both sides so I had a flat surface, put it in a vise, drill out what was left of the original hole, tap it, and then insert this this grub screw, or this set screw, into place, and then I permanent Loctite it in place. This is the only time in my 14 years of paintball I've used red Loctite, because I know I want this to be a permanent fix, not just a temporary one, because when you go to take this back cap off, you don't want that screw coming out, you want the whole cap. So I needed something really strong to hold it in place forever. So that's what happened there. There was one other screw on the bottom here. This is the cap, or the set piece that holds the ram assembly in place, and he had done the same thing, used the wrong Allen key, and so I had to cut that one or slot it for a screwdriver to get it out, which was, of course, fun. And then get that one out, and thankfully that one was just easy, and buy a new buy a new screw. So, or that one didn't require any crazy work there. So what we got going on right now is I'll show you where I'm at. Well, you have to take my word for it, I suppose. The ram sleeve is already in place with the poppet valve in front of it, and that was done off camera a little bit here. There's not anything too special about it. Just make sure the poppet's in front and your air passage hole is facing up when you put it in place. Most markers like this, it'll be really obvious because this one uses this set piece here to hold the whole ram sleeve in place. And if you have the ram sleeve rotated opposite of what it's supposed to be, you won't be able to set this in place. And if you can't set that place, and you can't get the frame on. So it's usually really obvious what's going on, and if it's correct or not. So this little set screw here, this is the one that was messed up. Just holds the little key in place, I guess you'd call it. I'm not sure what the technical name for it is. So that's in place. And one thing a lot of people have problems remembering, myself included, is don't forget your valve spring. That's going to go in before your LPR. This cap on the LPR here is so what's going on here, this is actually kind of an important piece of the marker to explain. Where the air comes into the marker, it splits into two paths. And the first path is to go over to the poppet valve, which is air that's going to go shooting down the barrel. The second path is to go in the LPR here. And if you can see, this is kind of a weird little how it functions. The high pressure air comes down the center here. There's the Schrader valve in the center. Once I get this out of the way. And the piston. Piston is there just basically to hit the Schrader valve. So there's our Schrader valve down in there, if you can see that. What happens is this piston face hits that Schrader valve and opens it up and lets a little bit of air through, and that air then goes down our hosing that we talked about last time and into the solenoid, and from there it controls the ram. But how it kind of splits here is kind of important. There's not anything, using the wrong spring there. There's not anything crazy about it, except that just if you want to understand how the marker functions, that's kind of one of the kind of critical parts there of understanding where the air is going. It's splitting in two, and half of it's going through the LPR, and the other half is going down to come out the barrel. So LPR goes in place here. A lot of manufacturers do this a little different. A lot of them use a screw. What Vanguard did here is they use this little pin. I think this is a really ingenious little solution because that guy, I don't need a screw, I don't need anything, and it's impossible to come out unless I have the LPR sleeve or the HPR sleeve here off. You see that little indent there? It sits in that indent, and then it cannot come out unless the sleeve here comes out. So kind of a cool little solution to a problem of keeping the LPR in place. I know I think it's Planet Eclipse uses their LPR just kind of screws into the body more or less, and that's not a bad solution, but it does mean your LPR can come loose under the right circumstances, and the way that Vanguard did it here, it literally can't come loose unless you have other problems going on. You'll notice your HPR would be leaking like crazy before your LPR came loose. So it'd be pretty obvious that something's going on. So that's in place. Oh yeah, one of the other things I did while I was off camera, I like my drop boards. I put them on just about every marker I can, and some I can't, including this one. So what had happened here, the holes here are the correct size and thread to accept. These are standard kind of ASA screws, I call them. They're on almost every marker that uses a standard 2-hole direct mount. But what Vanguard had done was they were spaced wrong. They were the correct size, they were correct thread, but one of them's in the middle here on the stock frame, and so I actually drilled this rear one and then tapped it so it could accept this direct mount. And I think the reason they did that was because it almost exactly lines up with this grip frame screw here. I don't know for sure, but when I drilled and tapped this one, it didn't actually hit that screw, so I don't know exactly why they did that. It's oh, you know what, now I'm thinking about it though, to the way that they originally mounted this ASA, you have to get an Allen key into the frame to go down. So, a little tidbit of information there that you'll never need for anything other than a Jeopardy game show, maybe. Which would be a very funny question to find on a Jeopardy game show. Alright, so, where are we at here? Let's get the HPR in place, which this guy is just kind of this big core. It's really simple and easy. One thing you have to watch out for there, and I just did it, was because there's only one screw holding this HPR sleeve in place, you can rotate it a little bit. You won't be able to rotate it once the frame is on because of this little notch here. The frame will prevent it from rotating, but as you're putting it together, you kind of have to keep it facing straight. So next thing is going to be the eyes. One question I get every once in a while is, how do you know which eye goes on which side? Usually it doesn't matter. Because all the eyes are doing is sending a beam from one side of the breech to the other, it does not matter if that beam starts on the left side and goes to the right, or starts on the right side and goes to the left. As long as they can see each other, it doesn't matter which side they're on. There are a few exceptions to that. In particular, Bob Long and any of the markers that use the 4C eyes, those do have a specific left and right, but it's because the boards are a little different. They actually use a small circuit board here for the eyes rather than just these little receptors and senders. So that's the reason they do those. But those ones, you can't actually mess them up because the connections on them, you know what, now I think about it though, I'm not certain it matters even for that one which side's on which, but the connections to the board are specific. So if you have one board on, let's say board A on this side, you can only connect wire A to it because of the way they set it up. So again, that one might not even matter which side it's on, as long as you have the correct wire going to the correct board. So, got our detent there in place. Don't forget the spring behind it. That's probably the most forgotten thing in paintball. I've bought a lot of markers that I take them apart and there's no spring in there. One thing on these guys, on the little eye cover screws, I always like to make sure I have some Loctite on them, because there's nothing worse than one of these guys flying off in the middle of a game, and you can, if you ever see one pop off, you just know automatically there's no chance of finding it. So just throw some Loctite on stuff. Really easy, simple solutions to simple problems. Another simple solution is to put your Allen keys back, but I don't really do that. So, detent, spring. Sometimes these are a little difficult to line up. A good way to check is when you're holding it down here, if it's got some spring pressure on the back side to it, then you know you're good. That one's in place. And on these little receptors, I don't know if you guys can see this, but usually there's a little dome piece on one side. That side needs to face into the breech, and a lot of times it's pretty easy because it fits into this little hole here. So they kind of only go in one way. I have seen a few markers where you can flip those around without realizing it. Oh, it helps if I put the detent in before the spring. And I've also been asked a few times how important are detents. And it kind of depends on what marker you're shooting, and a lot of times kind of what barrel you're shooting, your exact situation. On a lot of autocockers, the detents actually don't do too much, because those are a closed bolt system. The bolt pushes the paintball forward into the barrel, and then it rests waiting for you to pull the trigger. On most open bolt markers, which are the vast majority of markers out there, if it's not a pump and it's not an autococker, chances are it's an open bolt, unless it's something really old and unique. But on most open bolt markers, the detents are pretty important because they hold the paintball ready to fire in the breech, and if you don't have them, what can happen is a double feed, where you get a paintball that starts rolling down the barrel and then another one that feeds in behind it into the breech. So if that's what happens, you know, if your detents get worn down, that's exactly what can happen. So one thing I like to do after I put these on is just stick my finger down the breech and make sure both detents are retracting like they should be, so there's nothing binding there. So that's all set. Probably our next guy here is going to be the ram. There it is, which I forgot to put some grease on earlier. Grease is your friend. Don't need too much. On these rams, most spool bolts will have this. There's two O-rings on this one, so it's super simple. The top O-ring and the bigger one is called the sail O-ring. It's actually what separates the air on both halves of the ram here. The one in front is actually just a bumper. Its only job is to kind of cushion the impact when the ram comes forward and hits the front of the ram sleeve. Likewise, on the back, on the ram cap here, there's an O-ring that is the rear bumper. And so it's same thing, its only job is to stop the momentum of the ram when it comes back. So our new little screw here seems to be functioning perfectly, exactly how I wanted it. So there's that. And get our little air passage tube in place there. Next guy is going to be, let's get the frame back in place, I believe. The only really big thing you need to remember when putting these frames back on, I guess actually there's two things. Sometimes companies will integrate a slot for a screw, and so when you're putting these back on, you have to make sure and get the screw in the frame before putting the frame on the body. This one does not do that, so I don't have to worry about that. The one thing you do usually have to worry about is the wires. So get them in place first, take your time, because if you pinch the wires and you screw something up, you know, your best case scenario is it's a $30 pair of eyes. Your worst case scenario is it's an $80 solenoid. A lot of times I have soldered these wires before in the past and been successful at it, but it's just not something you want to go through, so take your time. You know, make sure there's lots of slack in them. Make sure when you put the frame down there's no gap on either side, because that can indicate that you're pinching something. I'm gonna get my two screws in place here, if I remember which one goes where, which I totally don't. So we get to play a little guessing game here. Now these Vanguards, there is the tiniest of tiny little gaps between the frame and the body here, and I know that that's there, so I can keep that in mind. I know I'm not pinching anything. Also, because one of the ways you can tell is how much wiring you have exposed here. So if you only have a tiny little bit, chances are it's bunched up somewhere. You might want to stop and reassess. But I know I have enough there to cover the length it should be. So after this, it's pretty straightforward. I mean, if you've gotten this far into the marker, you pretty much know what you're doing at this point. Just a couple of macro fitting connections, and it's time to air it up. One thing I should mention, when you're first airing it up, I like to zero out the regulators. You'll have to read your manual to see which way each one goes. On this particular one, I know going counterclockwise on the LPR is going out. So I'm going to leave this one out most of the way, because what I want to happen when I first air it up, after I've gone through the entire thing, is there to be almost no pressure coming through it. You don't want to air it up and think that it's just going to be back to right where you were when you left it, because what you can have happen is you can basically be over pressurizing it the first time you pressure it up. And usually there are safeties built in to prevent any permanent damage, but it's just not something you want to do on a regular basis. So try to avoid that. Whoop, almost forgot my bolt here, which I just had the core pop out of, so I'll find that. But bolt, you can figure out on your own. So yeah, that's about it for Electropnumatic poppets. If you guys have any questions, let me know. If you'd like to see anything in specific, let me know. I do have a spool valve I will be doing at some point. But if there's any other marker designs you'd like to see, let me know. I also have my autococker coming back from anodizing, so that will be another video at some point. But I don't know how much help it's going to be, because my autococker is so custom at this point. I have custom metalwork, and it doesn't even operate like a normal autococker at this point. So I'll still make that video, but it's don't expect it to be the end-all be-all video for autocockers, because it is so unique. But yeah, thanks for watching. If you guys got any questions, let me know.